Yes, I'm very happy to be here to discuss this idea, really, which of the plural climate storylines. As you can see from this list, we have a lot of authors. This is because we try to engage with some of the physical sciences around exploring climate futures and think how we can enrich these ideas with also some perspectives from the social sciences and some decolonial perspective, as Mark said. So there's three of us here, and we hope we can make justice to the paper through with the three of us. So in the first part of the presentation, I will discuss how we came up, why we thought it was important to think about plural climate storylines. And in the second part of the presentation, we will be looking a bit more in detail into the four pillars that we have developed for the plural climate storylines. So the underlying idea is that physical climate sciences are extremely important to help us understand climate change and climate futures. But we also argue that thinking about futures or examining futures only by looking at the physical aspects overlooks the uneven outcomes that these climate futures might have, and that there is a need to develop climate information that is also justice focused and focused on ensuring more equitable futures. And so the purpose of the climate of our framework is actually to think how we can pluralize knowledge in ways that can generate information that can lead to more equitable futures and inclusive futures. So in the first part of the paper, I will make this argument, and in the second part of the paper, we will focus more specifically on the framework. And so to start making this point, I will start with the pictures that you see here. You might be surprised to hear that this is actually a reservoir from a dam. So this is actually supposed to be the water reservoir, one of the water reservoirs of the city of Cape Town. And you can see that this is basically completely empty. And this is how it looked like.
Ay, qué vergüenza estaba con la...
And this is how it looked like in 2014, as you can see, as a proper reservoir with water. And so what happened between 2014 and 2018, we can see this is some data from annual rainfall, and we can see how towards the right, between 2015 and 2018, there were several years with very low levels of precipitations, which have had significant impacts on the water availability of Cape Town, which then became very famous and very talked about across media in the global north and global south with the name of Day Zero, this idea that the city would end up without water in April 2018. And so that there would be no water for the people living in the city, not even drinking water from the water utility. Here you can see, just to give you some ideas of the impacts on the dams, you can see the storage of the 6th dam in Cape Town, and you can see how, again, between 2015 and 2017, 18, and beginning of 18, the water availability was extremely limited. So between those years, and often it is argued that this happened quite late on, the municipality enforced a number of measures to reduce water consumption, to manage the demand, and to ensure that that Day Zero could be delayed and then avoided altogether. And if you look at the diagrams, you can see how these measures become more and more intense in the diagram on the left, as well as the measures became much more stringent, reducing significantly water consumption per person per capita per day, as well as slowly incrementing the tariff throughout these 3 years. And one thing that is interesting about Cape Town is that it was often discussed as as a crisis, as a water crisis, climate-related water crisis that was affecting middle and higher income groups more than lower income groups. So this is, there's several reasons, and perhaps I won't be able to talk to that a lot in this presentation, but certainly it has been the first time where white middle-class people, for example, are seen queuing to collect water from public standpoints. And certainly it is true that middle and higher income groups in Cape Town were the ones who had to reduce more significantly their use of water from the water utility. But that was also particularly because of the extreme water use that they practiced before the drought. And so here you can see, for example, a news item from Al Jazeera, and you can see how it is stated that everyone in Cape Town will be left without water. There have been several papers that have shown that that's not really the case. Indeed, higher income groups had to reduce more significantly the consumption, but also they had many more ways to cope with the water crisis and were able to adapt much quicker than lower income groups. And if you look at these diagrams, there are two things that we can note from this diagram. From the map, we can see that there is a clear division of income in the city of Cape Town, with some groups being defined very good on the socioeconomic index, and other groups as very needy on the socioeconomic index. And in the diagram on the right, we can see how that leads to a very different levels of water consumptions before the drought already, which then has also implications after the drought. So you can see neighborhoods like Constancia, which is at the top of the diagram, where people are consuming around 10,000 liters per capita per day, 10,000 liters. And then you have, at the other extreme, you have a neighborhood like Philippi, where the water consumption before the drought is 10 liters per capita per day. And so when the drought hit and the rationing measures are enforced, we find very different experiences of drought across the city. Surely, higher income neighborhoods need to reduce more significantly their consumption, but they also have the financial resources to respond very quickly. And so what we see in Cape Town is that many install rainwater harvesting facilities and shallow well and boreholes to actually increment privately their use of water. We see that middle-income people can use other sources. They have cars to go to buy water and have the financial resources to buy bottled water, for example. While for lower income groups, this is much more of a shock. It's a much more of a experience of water insecurity than in middle and high income areas. So this is to say that whilst this crisis was presented as a crisis that hit equally everyone in the city, the reality is much more complex. Pre-existing inequalities did significantly shape the experiences of the drought. And this brings us a little bit closer to what our framework wants to add to projections and understanding of climate futures. Because it is obviously clearly stated and clearly argued by many scholars that climate-related risks, managing climate-related risk will require actionable insights in climate futures. And that means not only useful information, but also usable information that is framed in ways that can be easily interpreted and acted upon by organizations at different scales dealing with climate adaptation. And obviously, climate models play a really important role. They provide fundamental information around changing weather patterns and climate patterns. And that also applies to the case I just discussed of Cape Town, where there were regional predictions of reduced rainfall, which indeed is what happened in Cape Town. But at the same time, we argue that this information isn't really enough to ensure justice-focused policies and responses to climate change. And this is for two reasons. One is that this prediction do overlook or do not focus on understanding how this intensifying climate extremes impact differently different groups in cities and beyond. And the second is that this information is difficult to downscale, so it provides global and regional information that is difficult to interpret for actors operating at local scales, particularly the level of uncertainty around what these climate projections project and what uncertainties there are in these projections. And so we are thinking with our Plural climate storyline framework how we can extend or how we can contribute to explore climate futures or envision climate futures in ways that also consider these aspects. And we think about this framework as a way to basically generate information that can empower end users to also think about questions of justice and equitable development. And we do this in our paper, thinking about cities. Of course, this could be applied also to different types of storylines. But as a group, we are a group of scholars that have mostly works at the urban scale. And we also see the reasons for focusing on urban areas around the importance of cities in terms of having the majority of the population living in cities and concentration of assets, not only economic assets, but also cultural assets, religious assets in the city. So there is a lot of built environment and value to protect in cities, but at the same time, cities are increasingly challenged by intensifying climate extremes across the global north and south. And they are also deeply unequal places. So that means that the adaptation gap is quite unequal across urban spaces. And that's particularly true for informal settlements, which have limited adaptive capacity. The IPCC report also highlights that cities are already unable to manage current urban climate risks. And so with intensifying climate change, challenges might become even more significant. And also the SDGs testify to the need to focus on cities and particularly focus in one of the targets on reducing mortality and economic losses caused by disasters and climate-related disasters. So that's our focus, and that's what we will be using as an example to outline the 4 pillars of our Plural climate storyline framework. But we also are conscious that this could be repurposed for other types of storylines that do not have necessarily to focus on the urban scale. And so just to sum up and to extend a little bit the critique, in general, and this comes, I apologize, from a social scientist, and none of the physical scientists are here today, so my critique is going to be of climate projection is going to be a little bit shallow. But what we see, projections, they provide important insights on physical processes of future climate change, and also on the drivers of this future climate change. They are generally providing analysis at global and regional scales, and this analysis is probabilistic. So if we think about a region like Southern Africa, climate projections might tell us what are the likelihoods of a drought of a certain intensity threshold to happen within a certain time frame. And the resolution is quite wide, and so it meets the needs of global and national users more than it does, for example, meets the needs of local users like policymakers at urban scale and civil society organizations at urban scale. Physical storylines, climate storylines have emerged as an alternative approach to projections, and with the aim really of enhancing the usability of climate data. They are non-probabilistic, so in a way, I think they help build narratives that are closer to understand and to interpret and to mobilize by social scientists. They are non-probabilistic in the sense that they do not, they try to think about how a drought would look like, for example, if it would happen in the southern African region, rather than thinking about what is the probability that it will occur. And in that sense, it increases interpretability and usability of local actors. But both methods, we have argued in our paper, are in a way power blind and therefore justice blind. They don't think about how the impacts will unfold, and basically they don't focus on the justice and equitability criticalities of the climate projections. They are top-down in the sense that they are the stories of the storylines that are produced, for example, are produced by natural scientists. So these futures that they develop are in a way top-down. And they also overlook alternative imaginaries, alternative outcomes, alternative futures, as imagined, as projected by those who are affected the most by climate change. And so that's what we propose with our plural climate storyline framework. We would like to extend some of these ideas, some of this analysis of the futures through interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary approaches that can pluralize the way the stories that are told through the projections and through physical climate storylines. And in particular, here we have proposed 4 methodological schools to do that. Power-sensitive storylines really focus on unraveling injustices in future climate risk. Decolonizing storylines that Mark will discuss more in detail, talk about, invoke more centering marginalized epistemologies. Co-producing storylines is really about engaging communities as co-researchers and designing and co-designing solutions to adaptation, climate adaptation in this case. And aspirational storylines aim to catalyze the emergence of desired futures that are not necessarily shaped only by responding to the climate emergency, but also reimagining alternative futures. So I will briefly introduce the power-sensitive storylines and then pass on to Mark and Alice to discuss other approaches. Here, the idea with the power-sensitive storylines is really to think about what will be the outcomes, what will be the social political responses to future extreme events, particularly in the context of intensifying climate change. And how will power, economic visions, and differential agency shape the outcomes of intensifying climate extremes. And so climate projections help us to understand the physical processes, and critical social sciences can help us understand the intersectional dimensions of inequalities, the power dynamics, and the vested interest in maintaining the status quo that shape differential outcomes. And we think this is critical. Identifying these dynamics is critical, really, to be able to develop policies that ensure more equitable futures. And so I have this plus climate projection plus critical social sciences, but obviously it's not an easy combination. If you think about critical social sciences, these usually work or draw on retrospective analysis. So some would call them histories of the present, and which means understanding how past sociopolitical and economic processes shape current inequalities in cities and differential vulnerabilities to climate extremes. On the other hand, climate projections are much more future-oriented, and they also operate generally at very different scales. I think case studies tend to be, or research in the critical social sciences tends to be more localized, while projections are more regional and global. And of course, there is different data sets that are used for this analysis. I don't want to go in too much detail because I want to leave room for other aspects of the framework. But over the past 5 years, I've been working with colleagues in hydrology and climatology to develop a sort of new approach to scenarios that can, I think, combine these different elements in ways that is also respectful of epistemological and methodological differences. So here we haven't used physical storylines, but we use climate projections to understand how climate might change in a specific region we are interested in. And then we combine these climate projections with the social science theories around critical disaster studies and political ecology to understand patterns in responses to extreme events, climate change, including floods, droughts, and heat waves. And then we look at a location we are interested in doing a scenario for, and look at past responses to extreme events or to climate-related droughts or floods, and do a case study analysis, in-depth case study analysis of the location. But then we also look at a different location in which this same hazard has occurred in a more intense way to see if the responses of the cities might change in a context of greater and more intense climate change. And we try to bring together this into a scenario. We've done this for Maputo, and we've done this using projection for Southern Africa, social science theories on responses to drought, looking at past droughts in Maputo, and then using the case of day zero to think about scenarios of more extreme droughts and how they might unfold in the case of Maputo. Yes, I think this approach has some advantages, and these advantages are that it extends, provides a more interdisciplinary understanding of the impacts of a drought in this case in Maputo. It is a very impact-focused vision of future, so it's much more usable and actionable data that we provide in this way. Because we look at a particular case study and we look at a particular event, and that provides quite specific insights on who will be affected and how and which areas are more at risks across urban spaces. And it has potential to provide data that can generate more equitable policies. And so it's a very situated way of thinking about scenarios and how they can enhance climate justice. But at the same time, the knowledge production remains within the academic domain. Surely we extend to social sciences, but it remains within the academic domain. And the focus is really on business as usual. So what the scenario really does is think under current political economic structures, how might a city be affected by a more intense or an unprecedented event. And so it doesn't really allow for the emergence of more transformative futures. And for that, I think that the approaches that Mark and Alice will introduce are really important in terms of rethinking about the role of science and climate science, and in terms of co-producing futures with affected communities. So I'll pass on to them.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Maria, for that insightful presentation, which you've eloquently done. So I will take over to say something about decolonizing storylines. The first I want to talk about is on the subject of redistributing power in climate knowledge production. I know climate change is happening across the globe and everybody's affected because of our interconnectedness as a people and as communities within this shared platform called the Earth. So instead of us submitting ourselves to a single knowledge system or hegemonic narrative that perpetuates coloniality and Western ways of knowing, the decolonizing storylines recognizes and respect marginalized epistemologies. And this is very important because we are tackling this subject of climate change as a whole. I know within the discourse on climate change, system thinking is so much embedded in it. And so no one should be left behind. So this idea that a certain narrative is superior than another type of narrative on climate change should be dismantled. Okay, and in the past and currently, however, the science of climate change is often viewed to be produced exclusively out of Western scientific traditions or universities. And we've got statistical insight that provides some evidence on maybe climate change in terms of the climate change science or mitigation or adaptation. But behind those statistics, there is a story. And that story needs to be uncovered. We need to provide space for different views to inform our thinking about climate change, and particularly within the urban context. Okay, so the decolonizing storyline seeks to challenge this Western epistemic dominance to foster climate justice. Western epistemic hegemony is often built and sustained through cognitive appetite. I'm originally from Cameroon and I've visited South Africa. I know so much about appetite, you know, whereby there is this system that provides a kind of a dichotomy. You're there, I am here. There is no connection. So people live in disconnect. And so Western epistemic hegemony is often sustained through this notion of cognitive appetite. That is a willful segregation that denies eligibility to non-Western or scientific ways of knowing or knowledge systems. So the decolonizing storyline seeks to dismantle that ideology. So we need to respect other knowledge tradition. We need to respect other ways of knowing to inform how we conceptualize and how we think about addressing issues that pertains to climate change, particularly within the urban setting, but also not excluding other settings as well. And very much at the center of this decolonizing storyline is the idea of centering marginalized voices. And this emphasizes the lived experiences and knowledge of those disproportionately affected by climate change. So as I said initially, there is a story behind those figures. There is a story behind those graphs. There is a story behind all these scientific evidences. We're not discarding scientific evidences. Scientific evidences have got a place. We're looking at it within the context of the ecology of knowledges. And we're saying there is a place for the lived experiences of those who are particularly disproportionately affected by climate change. For instance, women, children, I come from a part of the world where women work so hard to earn income to support their children in education. Yeah. And they rely so much on tilling the earth on the land to provide a source of livelihood. So they'll be engaged in subsistence farming and other types of ventures, which are very much affected by climate change. So we need to listen to them. We need to capture their lived experiences. For us to center marginalized voices, we also have to encourage self-reflexivity, particularly within the context of us researchers. When we go out into local communities to research the context of resilience of climate change, how do we position ourselves, particularly if we are not from that community? There is the outsider and the insider dichotomy. If you come in as an outsider, how do you ensure that you're gonna put together something that will enhance relationality or build trust and get the local community to be active participants, exercise a sense of ownership of what you seek to do? Because once they're part of the process, the outcome is going to be relatable, right? It's going to be relatable. So we as researchers, we need to encourage the whole idea of self-reflexivity. We need to consider our positionality and also power dynamics in the research process. Okay. Next slide, please. So within the context again of decolonizing storylines, we need to think carefully about decolonial adaptation through local communities' environmental level. Many of our local communities, even within urban settings, are very much at the forefront of building resilience against climate change. So to discard their lived experience, their environmental label, wouldn't make so much sense. Okay, so drawing on the experiential knowledge of the ecological system developed through environmental label, local communities have been able to recycle 750 million liters of urban sewage each year through fish ponds, while simultaneously sequestering 60% of the carbon from the wastewater. There are different initiatives, there's what we call coping mechanism, for making the most of available resources. Those resources may be considered as waste in certain contexts, but local communities and their inhabitants have been able to be resilient by maximizing some of this waste, turn the waste around and use it for something productive that enhances their livelihood, but also support climate change adaptation. Take the case of turning trash into boats. And there's a common phenomenon out there in urban settings where, particularly where recycling is not very much part of the daily life. I'm talking about particularly the type of recycling we do in the West. So you find plastics litter around. And I've seen a case where people have taken these plastic containers and construct a boat, a boat that floats on a river that can actually help in transporting people from one side of the river to the other. So we should be able to engage different worldview, different experiences, different experiential knowledge that has come through environmental level, and that can give us an insight in how we think about resilience towards climate change. Okay, so these are some of the things we can capture as we think about decolonizing storyline within the context of climate change. So I'm going to end here, but we're going to be looking forward to questions to provide more clarity. But thank you so much.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. And I should note that these storyline sort of pillars are very much interrelated and complementary. So many of the points that Mark has just made, I think, will kind of carry over nicely to the co-producing storylines, which, as I'm sure many of you know, is both an approach to research that centers the knowledge of communities as well as in intervention. So, but I'll be focusing more on kind of the co-production of knowledge in this context, in which communities are engaged as co-researchers and experts, working alongside interdisciplinary researchers and or practitioners who in urban areas might include local planners, service providers, and collaboratively and iteratively generating knowledge that can help produce inclusive and locally relevant solutions. So this might include an array of data collection led by and informed by the priorities of local groups, such as qualitative, quantitative, spatial, and socioeconomic data on climate-related hazards, and then planning and modeling data that may complement those bottom-up findings. In turn, the outcome of this kind of approach to knowledge production would be co-produced storylines that would be practical, locally relevant, and implementable in the areas with a focus on equity and local appropriate ways forward. I'm just going to rush through this since I know we want to have time for questions. So next slide, please.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry. There we are. But we don't want to underplay the challenges of this. So there are certainly deep power dynamics that need to be addressed and transformed, including in power and expertise between research partners across the global North and South, as well as between academic and non-academic partners. We argue in the paper, and as I'm sure many of you are aware, that there are good practices along these lines that offer again, centering marginalized voices, local knowledge, and cross-sectoral partnerships, including the African Cities Research Consortium, examples from our partners at SDI. We know that this is a vast area and isn't always applied to the climate storylines per se, but we think that provides a really useful set of precedents and frameworks that we can build on in order to co-produce storylines in a more equitable way. So I'll leave it there, and then Maria will take us forward for the last kind of pillar of the framework. Thank you.
Sorry, I don't seem.
Yes, we're on the right side. Thank you.
Sorry, I have had some trouble managing two things. The microphone with the slides seems to be too difficult for me, but yes, here I am. I'll also keep this quite short, but I think, as Alice already mentioned, there is an overlap between this decolonizing, co-producing, and even aspirational storylines. The idea of the aspirational storylines is more forward-looking. All of them are, but this is the most forward-looking in terms of hopeful approach. And it's an idea of inviting to think communities, policymakers, and those involved in developing these aspirational storylines to think big and think how climate change can be also a transformative driver, and rather than only thinking about defensively responding to climate change, think about the potential of reimagining futures of climate change and reimagining, in this particular case, cities. I've just added here a few quotes that I won't go into detail, but obviously the idea to think, reconceptualize what is possible in the future, think about which narratives we want our future worlds to be grounded on, and think about the climate crisis not only as a crisis that requires solutions, technical and environmental solutions, but also as an imaginative project where we can have an opportunity or there is a need to rethink our and reimagine our cities and reimagine our relationship also with nature. And one of the approaches that we propose, which has been developed in particular by colleagues like Mark Penling and Taisa Comelli, is around normative future visioning, which is a really practical but imaginative approach at the same time, which is aimed at developing and visioning collaboratively urban futures, drawing on data collected by climate scientists, indeed, about climate futures, but also data collected by social scientists and urban planners, which are used as a foundation to examine where a given city is at and think about where, what futures are desired by communities in that city, and then think about how to develop pathways to achieve these futures. And so they do that with a range of techniques which involve co-mapping as well, and then thinking about alternative use of spaces, even of the built environment, reflect on the trade-offs that these transformations might generate, and then even use modeling and policy analysis to make sure that these futures are actually feasible, that they will generate some of the expected or hoped results, but also that they align with the regulatory framework. And the reason to do that so grounded and so context specific and in line with the framework is that there is really an attempt then to translate these visions and normative future visions into spatial plans that are then negotiated with policymakers and urban actors as a way of lobbying for a certain change in the city. In these aspirational storylines, we present also different approaches. I will skip this because I think the idea is clear. And I close with this, being aware of your perspective. I think our presentation and our paper argues that climate projections are essential, and so are climate storylines. But we propose to think about climate futures and climate science in a more extended way, as composed of different types of knowledges and different types of experiences, and being aware that all our knowledges come from a certain perspectives, are situated, and therefore are partial and cannot provide a full answer or a full examinations of climate futures. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much.